After the fall of the Romanovs, and not too long before he became the first premier of the Soviet Union, Lenin planned a forced immigration for some of EMIGRATION, for some of the most ideologically problematic Russian intellectuals who were living in the country at the time. While Lenin's efforts were nothing like the later mass purges that Stalin would issue, he did a lot to ensure that the transition from monarchy to the USSR and its state capitalism, including making sure that the influence of intellectuals who weren't wholly sympathetic to Lenin's new economic ideas, would never have the ability to actually peddle that influence. In September of 1922, well over 100 intellectuals and all of their family members, many of their family members, were forcibly deported from their homes on board two ships, the most well-known one being the one that's in the name of this book, known as the Philosophy Steamer. This book is Lenin's private war, the voyage of the Philosophy Steamer, and the exile of the intelligentsia. In this book by Lesley Chamberlain, she tells stories of the people who were on these ships, their ideas, their lives, what preoccupied them, and what it was like when they ended up in their new homes in Europe after they were sent away. Chamberlain weaves together what's actually quite a bit more than just the voyage of the Philosophy Steamer that the subtitle describes. It's really a story of exile and displacement, physical and intellectual, and ultimately a reshaping of one's life in a foreign land. Most of the intellectuals aren't terribly well known, at least here in the United States. But a few might be somewhat familiar to you depending on what you're reading and your academic interests are. The lives that I was especially interested in, because I previously knew of them, were the Russian mystic and theologian Nikolai Berdyaev, the writer Maxim Gorky, the sociologist Peter Rim-Sorokin, and the structuralist linguist Roman Jacobson. A very few recognizable figures pop up from time to time, including Shostakovich and Vladimir Nabokov. The fascinating thing about many of the people on the ship and its sister ship is that they didn't want to leave behind the land of their birth, and even more ironically, I guess, that many of them were socialists. Their fatal flaw, however, seemed to be their collusion with theism, and particularly, being Russia, the Orthodox Church. Just as a side note, because of the hardy interrelationships between Orthodoxy and socialism in 19th century Russian thought, many of the exiles were both Christians and socialists, which is a phenomenon that we would really hardly recognize in our peculiar historical moment and what we think of as sort of contemporary American Protestant Christianity, but of course they weren't Protestants, and they weren't really from our time. So their version of Christianity and socialism was something that you saw quite often together in the same person. It was very familiar to Russians at the time. Lenin's materialism, though, simply didn't have a place for God in his philosophy, and therefore these people couldn't stick around. In fact, Gorky even considered himself to be an ally of Lenin, and was frankly shocked when he found a member of Lenin's Cheka knocking on his door one night to take him away. The Cheka being Lenin's secret police. Much of Chamberlain's book details what happens when the exiles land at their new homes, which for most of the people she's writing about are Prague, Berlin, and Paris. Sorokin was an exception, who actually ended up in the United States and founded the Harvard Sociology Department. The politics and the opinions of these thinkers are really an integral part of the book and are really much too diverse to be fully fleshed out here, but many of them thought that Lenin's little experiment would be history in no more than a decade or so, and that they would be able to return home to their former lives in not too many years. Of course, little did they know that it would be 2 generations later before communism fell. This book easily could have just been about Lenin or an account of the time spent on the ship or some other narrowly focused aspect of this history, but Chamberlain strikes a fine balance in integrating all of these together into something cohesive and interesting and compelling. She does from time to time take a bit of novelistic license in imagining details of certain lives which we don't actually have record of, which can get tedious. But this is an overall enjoyable, well-told narrative of a tumultuous time in history, and also the seemingly universal precariousness of the intellectual in the 20th century. It's an interesting book. Lenin's Private War, The Voyage of the Philosophy Steamer, and The Exile of the Intelligentsia by Lesley Chamberlain.